All right, so I'm going to talk to you about my first book project. This is the book here, Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win. This was my dissertation. So those of you who are in PhD programs and hoping that your dissertation will become your first book, that's the exact process that I'm talking about. So I'm going to be talking about doing field research and archival work in grad school as well as an assistant professor, because I continued to work on the book the first couple of years when I was at Boston College. So I'm just going to spend like 2 or 3 minutes giving you an overview of the questions I was asking in the book and the argument I had, going to what we were mentioning with Jeffrey before about how I didn't just dive into the archives until I knew the question I was asking and some of the arguments I wanted to analyze. But the majority of it, I'm going to talk about particular archives I went to and some of the challenges that I faced. So my book asked 2 questions, or my dissertation initially asked 2 questions. One is, why do some national movements succeed and others fail? So basically, we have, a couple hundred states in the world today. A majority of them are the result of national movements, of people saying we've got common language, history, culture. We want to have political autonomy or independence in a common piece of territory. But obviously some of those succeed, and then others to this point have not been successful. We can think about the Kurds, or to varying extent the Palestinians, which is one of the cases I looked at, who have not yet had kind of full sovereignty over a piece of territory the way they would like. The second question I asked is, why do the various organizations within these movements, and again, very few movements have a single organization. They often have multiple political parties or rebel groups or various other types of activists. Why do some of them opt to employ violence, whereas others deploy not violence or even restrain violence from the movement? And then secondly, why at various points are these organizations opting to negotiate with the state government that they're fighting against, whereas others are trying to spoil those negotiations? So I've got this kind of 2-tiered question of the success or failure of the movement, and then the behavior of the actors within the movement. And those are the questions I'm trying to ask. So in brief, I had a theoretical answer to both of them. The answer to success and failure is that I said, look, it has a lot to do, and you can see I have some background in IR as well as comparative, is that I kind of use the basic idea of like unipolarity, bipolarity, et cetera, or if you think in terms of economics, kind of a capitalist versus and free market versus a monopoly. And the idea was, hey, if you have a hegemonic movement, which is not just a single group, but a group that dominates other organizations in terms of its membership size, its money, its arms, etc., more than 3 times the size of the others, I would call it a hegemonic movement. And the argument was hegemonic movements are going to spend less time fighting amongst themselves. They're going to have a more clear and cohesive message to international supporters. They're going to be able to have a more cohesive strategy to fight against the state and negotiate credibly with it. Whereas if there's 2 or more significant groups, whether they're united or not, they're going to spend a lot of time internally competing. They're going to have mixed messages. One's going to negotiate while one is spoiling. And ultimately, it's going to be less successful. So that was the theory that I had. And then in terms of the argument about behavior, and again, there's a lot of detail on this slide, but I'll just say a couple of basic things. The argument was kind of like based on prospect theory. If you are the hegemon, or if you are leading a movement, the idea is you're going to be very risk averse, and you kind of want the game to end. So think about a game of musical chairs where the various rebel groups are walking around the throne, and what every group does is they want the music to stop when they're standing in front of the throne so they can become the new government, right? So the hegemon is basically in the catbird seat, saying that if we win at this point, if we all of a sudden get a negotiation or defeat the state, I'm now the dominant organization, so I'm probably going to become the new prime minister, the new leadership of the government, et cetera. So therefore, I'm both going to be striving for victory, and I'm going to somewhat tamp down on escalatory violence, because violence is a pretty risky thing that can kind of change the hierarchy of the movement. Whereas if I'm a weaker organization, I don't like my position in the hierarchy right now. If things end right now, if the music stops, I'm not going to be powerful. And so therefore, I'm not always going to turn to violence, but violence is going to be much more attractive because I'm risk acceptant, and violence can potentially shake up the game, get me some new recruits, get me some notoriety, maybe provoke a war in which the government is going to crack down on that top group instead of me, and so change the hierarchy. So that was also the theory that I was trying to look into. So I then turned to the empirics of it and said, oh, okay, I want to analyze this. Now, as I mentioned before, I was trained as a historian and much more of a qualitative researcher than quantitative, although in recent years I've done some experiments, I've done some statistical analysis, but it's not as much my bread and butter. And beyond that, I actually, given the theories that I had, didn't really have the choice to do kind of a large N analysis. Why? Because I'm doing this micro level claim about the strength of every single organization inside a national movement at every different point of time. And to this day, there is no data set that exists with reliable reliable information about the membership size of every rebel organization at every point in time across all of these national movements. What there is great data sets on kind of data about the entire movement, and then some stuff about particular groups, but not necessarily year by year. And so that's what I really cared about. So I said, okay, I'm going to be digging in and creating or finding this information myself with a small number of cases. And so I picked these four. I picked the Palestinian national movement, the Zionist movement, the Algerian national movement, and the Irish national movement. And I picked this in first part because it had variation in the outcomes that I cared about, right? You have Algeria, which is a successful national movement, and the Zionist movement successful. They both get a state pretty much along the lines of what they want. You have the Irish case, which is a mixed bag, where they get the Irish Free State and later the Republic, but they don't get Northern Ireland as part of it. And then you have the Palestinians, which to this point has not been a successful national movement. All that being said, there's also tremendous within case variation within each of these, right? So the Palestinians have had more or less success over time, as, by the way, did the Zionists and the Algerians, decades of failure before ultimate success. So I cared about it there. I cared about because there's multiple competing theories about these cases, about why groups were successful or not, or why behavior happened a certain way. I had some time and space variation here where I was looking at 3 cases within the Middle East, but 1 external case, as well as changes over multiple decades. And then ultimately, I'm someone who believes, yes, I do want to do good historical work. I want to do good political science work, but I also do care about engaging with the broader community of citizens, of scholars, of the policy community. So that also had some impact on my case selection as well. So what did I decide to then do? I said, okay, I have to get information on all these various nationalist organizations, their membership size, their funding levels, their armaments, and then also the reasoning behind their decisions about why they're using violence or not, why they're negotiating or not, their successes and failures. And so I decided to do kind of mixed methods in the sense of I wanted to interview people who were members of each of these organizations, oftentimes elites within the organizations who were there in the room when they were making decisions about negotiating, about escalating or de-escalating violence. But also I knew that I had to do a lot of archival work. So I did archival research in 6 different countries for this project. So I was at the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut. They also have a headquarters in DC, but that's when I was in Beirut and living in Hamra. I was spending time in the Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence in France, because again, I was looking at the French archives about Algeria. I was at CIMA, the archive in Oran, so that's where one of the places where I was working with Bill Quant's documents, as well as some other documents. The British National Archives, which Jeffrey mentioned before, that are in London, the Public Records Office and Lynn Library up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and then a bunch of archives inside of Israel. A number of the different nationalist rebel organizations among the Zionists, the Haganah, the Palmach, etc., have their own archives in addition to the Central Zionist archives. And so I spent a lot of time going to state archives, going to individual group archives, doing kind of local private stuff over a series of years. So again, just in brief, this is the field research I did for this book and this dissertation. And you can see I spent a lot of my early time when I was in Israel and the West Bank doing some exploratory work initially for a month or 2, but then spending, significant chunks of time, 5 or 6 or 7 months at a time, doing a combination of working in archives and doing interviews with members of these national movements. And for my dissertation, to be clear, I did not do all of this field work or go to all of these places. For my dissertation, I just did the field research for the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. So the way I wrote it up was, in my dissertation, I had really good in-depth knowledge about the inner workings of these organizations, about their relative strength, relative success and failure over time. And then in my dissertation, I wrote up Algeria and Ireland as kind of more shadow cases where I had read the secondary source literature, but I had not yet done interviews and archives. And then I had a decision to make once I became a professor of saying, okay, do I want to just kind of get this book out there? I think it still would have been above the bar to be published at a university press, but it wouldn't have been the book I really wanted it to be, which is in-depth archival research and interviews for all of my 4 cases. And I decided, thankfully, being at BC, a school that gave me some good research support, but also was a school that was not requiring me to do, say, 2 books for tenure, just kind of 1 good book with some articles. I made the choice to then go back to the field in Algeria and Northern Ireland for multiple years to do the field work for that. So again, when you think about your dissertation project or your archival work, you don't have to think about getting everything done for your dissertation. You want to think about certain things and think about the project maybe in longer term, depending on what your needs are for publication, for jobs, etc. One other key point I wanted to bring up here about affiliation, because you can see I have some affiliations here. that's a tough one sometimes, because when you affiliate with a university or with a center, it can open some doors, but it can also close some doors, because obviously, as you know, with Middle East politics, especially Jeffrey was mentioning in Lebanon, there's tension, there's political tension like there are in any society, just like in the United States today, right? And so I made a lot of decisions about, do I want to affiliate here? And my affiliation choices were not just based on research. I'm someone who is trying to be a teacher of Middle East politics to understand various perspectives on this stuff. So I would affiliate with places that sometimes, to be honest, I didn't necessarily agree with the politics of the individuals who were working there or otherwise, but I wanted to learn about the research they were doing. And then in some cases I was affiliating because it would help me to get access to the country or the people who I'm working there with. So for example, access to Algeria, I could not have done that by myself. I was lucky enough to meet with Bob Parks and, I think it was at ISA, and talked about the research I wanted to do in Algeria. And he walked me through the process of how to get a visa to come to Algeria, how to submit a dossier to get access to the Algerian archives, which are held, I believe, in the president's office. And those are things I could not have done on my own. There are very few Americans, living and working in Algeria and getting access there. And so thinking about access and affiliation should be an important part of your research plan. Some places like, okay, you want to go work at Kew in the British Archives, you can just kind of plan that you're going to be able to probably go there and get access to varying degrees. But a number of other archives, especially if they're held by political parties or by organizations or in states that have access problems like Israel or Algeria, you have to really think that through early in the process. Okay, Jeff mentioned this stuff, so I'm not going to go through all these as they come up, but I'll just say briefly, in terms of archive access, I just can't stress enough, talking to at least a few academics, political scientists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, people who have been to the countries that you're going to go to and have worked in the archives that you're going to go to, will save you so much time and give you so much understanding about what's available, who to talk to, how much time you need. Like, those are just gold, those conversations. And so I know that some of us are a little more hesitant to make those connections, but this is not networking in a shallow sense. This is the good sense of talking to people who are working on the same thing that you're interested in and learning from them. And then you're going to pay it forward as well as, Jeffrey and I are maybe doing a little bit today of saying, we've done this stuff. Now, what can we tell you about it? So, again, people are generally very happy to talk to others about archives because, again, it's not that many people who go to these places and really put that time in. So they want to help you. Again, I'm going to mention throughout this little talk some other things you should look at because I can't go through everything, but Terrence Peterson wrote this great piece on War on the Rocks just last year about some of the declassification and reclassification fights that are going on. So one that's near and dear to me with the French archives, because again, I've done a lot of research on Algerian, and I know that Terrence has as well. There are all these national regulations. This is happening with the US too, where politically sensitive documents, say about Algerian counterinsurgency or torture in Algeria, or treatment of the civilian population, like sometimes governments come in and they decide we want to keep this stuff classified, or going to Jeffrey's point about how things are blacked out. These fights are ongoing all the time. And so you want to have a good sense of what the politics are of the archives at the time. This is unfortunately not something that's just being decided by scholars. It's often being decided by politicians. And so this is a great piece that I commend to you to read a little bit about one debate, but he links to many others that are happening with the French archives. I'll also say you should not be overlooking working with your IRB. Now, we all know, and many people will post on Twitter or whatever, oh, like my IRB is such a pain and you had an institutional review board. And to be clear, the IRBs were not created to deal with political science. And so a lot of what they do is deal with natural sciences. And I think they do some things that are problematic in terms of handling political science. But all that being said, on balance, I think the IRB is a net positive because it forces you to think through some of these ethical questions, logistical questions about how you're going to do work. And you might be like, well, I'm not talking to people, so these people, this is not endangering anyone. No, archives are very, very serious things, as we've talked about just now, in terms of access to them or otherwise. I put up this picture. This is a picture that I took on the Falls Road in Belfast, and it was nice to see some school pride there, Boston College. But touts, if you don't know, basically means informants. And so when I was there interviewing people and doing research in the archives in Belfast, there was this whole issue that I don't know if you've heard about, but basically there was this series of recorded interviews that not Boston College academics did, but some people who had been affiliated with the library here who were journalists did. And it became a whole debacle because honestly, they promised anonymity to people that they couldn't necessarily deliver legally when there started to be subpoenas to get access to this supposed oral history archive that wasn't going to be released until people had died. And so it's become, and it will be, this huge case study about not necessarily what to do ethically with doing interviews or working with archives. So working with your IRB about how you're accessing data, how you're going to protect your data. Again, when you're going across international borders, people want to look at your data. They want to grab your stuff. Sometimes you need to be thinking about how you're going to protect this, especially if you're working on sensitive subjects. Again, another piece I'll commend to you, Elena Subotic wrote this piece in JPR about the ethics of archival research. So again, don't think that you're doing archival research, ethics don't matter. You want to be conscientiously thinking about this stuff beforehand. I thought this was an excellent piece. Some of you mentioned about working on political violence. I commend this piece to you to read and think about some of these issues, and she links to a lot of other great research on these topics. As I mentioned, protecting your data. This is a picture from Ben Gurion Airport. I, like many people have traveled there, have had the issue of having to empty your whole bags, and maybe I've got books on Middle East politics or whatever else, and you can have these sometimes long encounters about being searched or things of this nature, and obviously depending on your ethnic or religious background, perhaps even more in depth. But you need to think about this stuff in terms of your data and the research you're doing, because again, you're doing political work, even if you don't think that you are. And we know all, unfortunately, some of these cases that are tough about, the Italian academic working in Egypt or some of these other places where, people met untimely ends or faced aggressive acts from regimes because of the work they were doing. So you need to think about protecting your data and protecting the stuff that you're working on. In terms of being in the archives, this is a picture from when I was in the British archive. And you can see I've got kind of maybe the older school technology. I got my DSLR up there. And this was actually great at the time because it's like, hey, I can just sit there, turn the page, click, turn the page, click. Things have advanced now. So going to Jeffrey's point, I think the best thing that I use now is on my cell phone. I have Scanner Pro. You can also use Devon Think, some of these others. Jeffrey mentioned you can actually just even use Google Drive. But the idea of being able to photograph documents that are not available online and have them accessible later is incredibly valuable. You will never be able to just take all the notes you want while you're there. You'll want to go back to stuff again and again. You want to have access to it. And so you will definitely spend some time taking photos of stuff. Now, deciding whether you want to do what I call the vacuum method, which is basically, as Jeffrey was saying, recreate the whole archive versus be a little bit more selective, that's up to you, and it might change depending on the documents you're looking at. But having a plan for how to do this is important. And again, talking to those other academics is helpful because not everyone has to reinvent the wheel, right? I didn't do this as well as I should have, but I mean, how many people are going to the British National Archives looking at some of these similar documents? Maybe they have some of these photos already and they can share with me so I don't have to recreate the same thing, or maybe I can share some of mine thereafter. And again, you have to get into some of the licensing of this stuff, but I think it's something that can be done, and you have those conversations with other academics. What are some of the types of things I found? This was something from the French archives in Aix-en-Provence. This was an incredibly valuable document to me, talking about actions against the French, against civilians, but also against military forces over different periods of time. And so I actually took this document and recreated it like this in my book, and it helped to address one of these key questions I had, right? All I did is I slapped on top of this document, okay, when was the Algerian national movement more fragmented, where they had multiple significant political parties and rebel groups, and when were they more hegemonic, when one group was dominating? I slapped that down in there, and I was like, hey, again, this is correlational. I'm not running an experiment on this, but in a broad sense, when it was fragmented, you saw more violence against civilians, which was in line with my theory, whereas when the movement became more hegemonic, actually the violence against civilians decreased significantly. Now, are there other factors that contribute to that? Yes, and I talk about them in the book, and I read about that in the archives. But again, sometimes you can find documents like this that are really helpful and translate directly to some of the things you're trying to analyze. Or I found documents like this looking at the deployment of forces by the FLN or the ALN, their military force, outside of Algeria and neighboring Tunis and elsewhere. Or in the British National Archives, this is about Zionist organizations and from their intel branch talking about their strength, their armaments over time, which I used to kind of collate group strength. And what I would do over time is I would be able to create, things like this. This is a stylized version, but I have the data behind it. This is looking at the Palestinian national movement, looking at the relative strength of these different factions over time, which again allows me to more directly test, okay, well, I'm predicting when this group is weaker and this one's stronger, they're going to restrain violence, they're going to escalate violence. Or in this period, when it's fragmented versus when it's hegemonic, it's going to be more likely to be successful here than here. And so again, I use the archives to kind of build up and create, we can call it data, whatever you want to call it, to be able to do this type of analysis. Things like this in Centre, the center in Algeria, Centre d'études maghrébines en Algérie, or in the Zionist archives, finding stuff about some of the Zionist parties and the electoral races that they were having in the days before the founding of Israel. So all this stuff is great. And as Jeffrey mentioned, again, archive stuff can be fun too, right? So this was a document I found about a dispatch, and it said, it was chronicling a telephone call, and it said, call proved impossible to trace, voice described as that of, quote, typical screen villain. very clipped accent. So it's just kind of like, sometimes you come across stuff that's interesting. Lindsay O'Rourke, who's a colleague of mine in Boston College, just wrote a chapter in our edited volume about fieldwork where she talked about the doodles in the archive. So she was finding all these doodles by President Eisenhower, you know, in the aftermath of like raids in Guatemala, where he's like drawing himself looking like this buff guy next to these ships, but like the insights that gave to his mindset at the time. So again, archives are not always kind of just these stale documents you're leafing through. It can give insights and they can be alive in terms of how people are thinking at the time. And as I mentioned before, you can access sometimes other people's stuff. So this is a picture of Bill Quant's field notes from interviewing Ferhat Abbas. And if you know anything about the Algerian national movement, Ferhat Abbas is one of the most important individuals who was involved with it. He obviously had passed away by the time that I did my field research in Algeria, but you know, Bill Quant was there just 5 years after Algerian independence talking to him. And this was incredibly valuable to me beyond just the secondary source literature that I saw. So that was great in terms of that project. As I mentioned before, when you go to the archives, don't always assume that what you're doing is simply, I've got these pieces of information I'm looking for. Now that matters, right? As Mark Trachtenberg taught me, you want to think about what are the observable implications of any theory or hypothesis, which basically means, how would I know this thing when I saw it? How would I know this phenomenon or this mechanism when I saw it? And you come up with a list of all of these pieces of evidence you could hypothetically find. And that's great because that keeps your antenna up for looking for that information. But as Jeffrey noted, that can also bias you towards looking and triaging certain documents versus others, and also close your mind off to different ways of conceptualizing the issue you're looking at or the questions you're looking at. So these kind of unknown unknowns, you should be open to that as well as you're doing archival work. So to close, I just want to say a couple final points for this. Sometimes people think about, how can we actually display archival research? Because again, this is part of it too. When you're trying to go on the job market, as I know many of you are going to do, you might be like, oh my gosh, you know, people who are doing field experiments, statistical stuff, they have all of these great tables that play really well and capture a lot of information in a small space. And, you know, job committees are really impressed by that. How can I actually present archival work in an interesting way? Now, one is, I'll commend to you the earlier Apsamena panel on, you know, text analysis and whatnot, because that's, you know, one way you can do it. But another way that I found, I actually went back, and it's somewhat embarrassing because again, it's not nearly as good as I would like it to be, but I went back to my job talk I gave at BC, you know, like 8 or 9 years ago, and I pulled a couple slides that I used from it. And, you know, these are some of the ways that I used archival documents in my talk. I basically took this document I had gotten from the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut, which was a Fatah pamphlet that basically talked about why they decided to launch armed struggle in January 1st of 1965, when they became kind of the first Palestinian faction to launch violence against the Israelis, when some of the stronger groups were kind of working with Nasser and trying to actually hold off on some escalatory violence. And so this was a way for me, amidst my broader discussion of the historical developments of the case, to kind of visually represent, okay, here's this document I worked from. Again, most people in the audience aren't reading Arabic, and so I'm having a translation of it there, but it's a way to kind of project that. And I did that again with a document from the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, talking about their decision to shift towards a different type of violent strategy using hijacking in the late 1960s from, again, some of their documents. So I think this is important to think about some of these ways as well, not just about how we write and document and use archival work, but also how we can explain it to an audience that doesn't exactly necessarily see what's the value of this, or how does this actually correlate up to our analyses. And again, these are just pull quotes. This is obviously not the core of what one is doing as an archivist or someone working in the archives, but just some ways I thought about it's interesting to kind of display this stuff. And at the end of the day, you know, if you look at the article I published that came out of this project, which is in International Security, like this table is entirely based on years of archival work and interviews, where I was able to document the relative strength of these different groups over time, as well as, you know, this is just me kind of summarizing, but in the article I go through all their various decision points and the actions they used of using violence, of not, of negotiating with the French government or not. And so all of this is the basis, or based on archival research. So just in terms of resources, I wanted to name a couple. I mentioned this book before. Ora Sekeli and I edited it. It's got about 44 different political scientists who are part of it, but many Middle East, it's actually disproportionately Middle East scholars. So we have people who have done extensive archival work like Mark Trachtenberg and Lindsay O'Rourke who write in it, but also we have Carla Abdel Katsipis writing about research in Lebanon, Nadia Haj about research in Palestine, Ian Lustig about, you know, a bunch of places, Amani Jamal, Mark Lynch, Wendy Perlman. So the purpose of this, kind of similar to this talk today, is to provide accessible stories about research you've done, the ethical challenges of it, how to actually carry this stuff out. So I commend that to you. And I also commend, these are a bunch of links here for different either libraries, going to Jeffrey's point from before, or there's a bunch of good resources online. There's this new digital fieldwork website run by a bunch of people at Georgetown that they're trying to build. There's a bunch of others, as Jeffrey mentioned, at Wilson Center. So again, there's many more of these, but all of these websites have multiple archives throughout the region and talking about accessing them both digitally and in person. And so I'll include those for the slides, and so people can check those out later as well. Okay, so with that, I will stop.